Some years ago, I was probably in my mid-20s. I was in college. We had some friends that invited us to go skiing. And I remember when I was a young man, when I was in high school, we actually would get out of school on Friday. We would get my friend's boat and we would go to the lake, and we wouldn't come home till Sunday night. We would go spend the night. We would fish. It was a different time back then. You guys probably wouldn't allow anybody to do that, but we would go and we would fish all night, and then we would ski during the day when it was the hottest part of the day, or we would tube. You guys, how many has ever went tubing? Has ever went skiing? What a great fun that is when you're young. Well, we had some friends who invited us to the lake, and we were going skiing. And it's really hard to communicate how significant the event is, knowing my friend. My friend is so intense. He is so over the top. He has a personality that just fills up a room. He is always the center of conversation. He is just one of those guys who is just intense at all times. And we were all in the boat, and we were taking turns skiing. And evidently, I heard about this later, but I was the one skiing, and Denise, and there was a young man who was the boyfriend of another member of his family who was there. And my friend was driving the boat, and I was back there. And I was not prepared after, 10 or 15 years of not skiing to get back on the water. I thought I was just going to I could ski barefooted. I mean, I was really good. I could ski barefooted, kind of plop down on my booty and jump back up. It was really hard to throw me off. That wasn't the case this time after 10 years. And so I was back there trying to ski as best I can on two skis. And you know how it is whenever your legs are not in shape and how they begin to quiver? Well, that's what I was doing. And this was my moment here as I'm going behind this boat. Well, evidently, the young man who was the boyfriend of another person on the boat was making fun of me. He was doing that little circus song, dun 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 dun. There, and he was trying to get everybody in the boat to laugh. And there I was, like, trying to be cool, which kind of cramps your style when your legs are quivering. But you guys know that song I'm talking about? Well, my friend, he is the type that you don't mess with his family, especially if he doesn't know you. You don't make fun of people, and he was highly protective of me. You remember that? And the look on he didn't say anything at that moment, but the look on his face spoke words. He was jealous for his family, for his friends, for anybody that was close to him. And he did not want anybody to make fun of me. I heard about that later, and I tell you, that just welled up more love for this guy. Even though you kind of put up with all the idiosyncrasies and all of this thing, you knew this guy loved you, and that was a good thing. What is it in your life that you are protective of? I know that Denise is sometimes protective of me. Some of you might be protective of a coffee mug. Many of you are probably protective of your kids, right? Especially if you're a mama. But we have a dog that was going to this one particular groomer, and he would come back and he would have like little nicks on his side and everything else, and he'd go straight to his water bowl and he would be just slopping up water, They weren't giving him water. I tell you what, that was almost fighting actions, in our case. So we found another groomer, but we're very protective of our dogs. But what are you protective of? Well, one of the things we're going to look at in the book of Acts is that we're going to see something that Paul was protective of. He was protective of God's reputation. And so as believers, God's reputation should be something that should be high in our list. The reputation of God. Our love and our relationship with God should be such that we are very careful the way that we present Him or represent Him to the world. And so the question we want to ask today is, how do we stand up for God's reputation when we face opposition? Because that's what's happening in this book. Oftentimes, there are times whenever you and I face opposition, for us to stand up for God is going to cost us something. Sometimes it may just cost us ridicule. Sometimes it may cost us a job. Sometimes it may cost you a relationship. Other times it may cost you your health. But oftentimes standing up for God in the face of opposition is very difficult. And the passage that we're going to be looking at today is not a passage that's usually extracted out of this portion of Acts and then preached on. Usually this particular passage is usually included in the story about the Philippian jailer, which is what we talked about. They'll just sort of include this in here on how Paul was released. But I think that there is a significant truth in here about what was underneath the surface of Paul that caused him to have such a protective attitude for the reputation of God. And so I want us to look at that. There's three things that do that, and we're going to look at all three of them here this morning. But let's go ahead and have a little background. Remember that Paul was in jail, and the reason that he was in jail was because he had cast out a demon from a slave girl. And the owners of the slave girl recognized that this was going to cost them some money, so they grabbed Paul and Silas and they dragged them over in front of the magistrates and began to make accusations about them, telling them that they were advocating for customs that were illegal for Romans to practice. That was the charge. Very vague, wasn't very specific, and just kind of slandering Paul and the apostles right in front of the magistrate, in front of the crowds. And we know what happened is that these magistrates, they're elected officials. This was a Roman colony, so you did not want to do anything that got the Romans upset. In fact, just a few years prior to this, the entire city of Rhodes lost its Roman colony status because they had crucified some Roman citizens. And so they were very sensitive about this. And these magistrates stripped Paul down and they beat him with rods and they threw him in jail. And last week we discovered how God rescued him and how he made that an opportunity for him to share Christ with the Philippian jailer. And we could just say, wow, it's good. Things are, it's a nice tidy bow. Let's move on. But there's something else that happens in our passage today that shows us what's underneath the heart of Paul and Silas. Why did they do that? A lot of times whenever we approach this passage, it's the main idea is that Paul used his Roman status. He demanded justice, and that a Christian should demand justice. And that is true. Christians, we should use the laws of the land in order to promulgate or to advance the kingdom of God. We should demand justice and require justice. But I don't think that's what Paul was doing here. That wasn't at least his motive, even though that's the strategy he took. What was his motive? Why did he do this? Why was it that he did not leave right away? So let's go ahead and jump into verse 35. In Acts chapter 16. And it says, when daylight came, this was after the earthquake and after the Philippian jailer had been baptized, he and his family, and they had been taken care of. When daylight came, the chief magistrates sent the police to say, release those men. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, and the magistrates have sent orders for you to be released. So come out now and go in peace. And so Paul and Silas both were washed by the jailer. He was fed by the jailer, but they were still in custody. And so these magistrates wake up the next morning. They're probably going through the rubble of whatever damage the earthquake had caused. They had remembered that they had beat these men. They didn't know that they were Roman citizens at the time, but they knew that they had beat these men and that an earthquake occurred over the night in the same day. And the whole city saw this. This was something that was publicly demonstrated, was these Jews who were beaten for advocating for customs that were illegal for them to follow. And so they recognized, well, whoever these men were, the gods are angry. And so they wanted to release them. It could have been that, or they could have just wanted to teach Paul and Silas a lesson from the get-go. And perhaps they thought, well, we taught these Jews, we're going to go ahead, they're from out of town, we're going to go ahead and just let them go. Whatever the case was, they thought that, well, they'll be glad to get out of jail. But that's not what happened. It says there that whenever the jailer, he himself also thought that Paul and them would be glad to go. In fact, he says, jailer said to them, sent orders for you to be released, so come out and go in peace. But Paul didn't do that. In fact, verse 37, but Paul said to them, they beat us in public without a trial, although we are Roman citizens, and they threw us in jail, and now they are going to send us away secretly? Certainly not. On the contrary, let them come out themselves and escort us out. Verse 38, the police reported these words to the magistrates. The police would have been these lictors, the guy who carried the bundles, who probably were part of the ones who beat him the day before. The police reported these words to the magistrates, and then they were afraid when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. So they came to appease them, and escorting them from prison, they urged them to leave town. After leaving the jail, they came to Lydia's house, where they saw and encouraged the brothers and sisters and departed. Inside this passage, we see the main point, is that believers stand up for God's reputation in the face of opposition by protecting the mission, the message, and the members of his kingdom. How is it that you and I can protect the reputation of God? Is whenever you and I stand up to protect the mission, the message, and the members of God's kingdom. That's what he's doing here. Paul could have gotten out of jail anytime he wanted to. He had already been released. So when they came and said, "Oh, let them go," they thought they were doing him a favor. He could have left at any time, but he didn't. Paul stayed there. It was his love for people and his love for God's kingdom. And that brings us to our first point, is that believers protect the mission of the kingdom. And that's what Paul was concerned with, was the mission. He could have left. He could have took the easy way out. They go, "Look, go in peace." Isn't it often that you and I are tempted to just go away quietly? Isn't it tempting oftentimes whenever we get into some kind of opposition for the gospel, that it's easier just not to say anything, or maybe just to go away quietly? Paul had his mind on the mission of God. His entire life was circled around the fact that the mission that God had given him was his central focus. And so even though he could have took the easy way out, he didn't take it. He goes, "No, there's something more important here." And so Paul, because of his own convictions, we look at Acts. He wrote about this later when he was talking to the Ephesian elders. He says, "I consider my life of no value to myself. My purpose," this was his whole goal in his life, "my purpose is to finish my course and the ministry I received from the Lord Jesus, to testify to the goodness of God's grace." Paul's entire life circled around this mission of God. And you and I are going to find it very difficult to stand up in opposition to God and protect his reputation in the eyes of others whenever we do not have that mission as ours. You're going to find it psychologically and spiritually difficult to do that if the mission of Jesus Christ is not running behind the scenes in your heart and in your life. We're going to find easy way out. We're going to say, "Well, I'll do it next time," or "I'll just do it this way." And so we can see that one of the things that they do is that they protect the mission of God. Galatians 5:13 says, "For you were called to be free, brothers and sisters, only don't use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but serve one another through love." Paul could have left. He could have easily taken the easy way out. "Wow, that was a big deal. We're going to move on to Berea. We're going to move on to Thessalonica." But he didn't, because of the mission that he had there. He knew that God had opened up a door for him. He knew that that earthquake was not an accident. He knew that everything that went on in that jail was not just some kind of happenstance. And so Paul's desire for these people, for the message of God and for the love of these people, kept him there. And so that brings us up to the second, is believers protect the message of the kingdom. So not only do they protect the mission of the kingdom, but they protect the message of the kingdom as well. Think about it. The entire city, the city in which Paul had been preaching those last few days, the entire city watched as they were accused of violating Roman laws. They were slandered against. And one of the purposes of Luke writing the book of Acts is that it seems that he is giving an account to Theophilus about how the gospel message spread all over the Roman Empire. But also, too, one of the purposes seems to be is to demonstrate how that the Christian faith is not subversive. How that the Christian faith, even though it had a lot of accusations and a lot of bad names given to it through the years, Paul was probably in prison whenever Luke was writing this, awaiting trial. He was made, perhaps this might be called a deposition. I think maybe Ms. Jackson might know the proper term for this, but this was an account of how things going. And so all through the book of Acts, you guys have noticed it, how that he's trying to show how that Paul and the apostles stood up for justice. They were not subversive, and they were actually encouraging people to obey the laws of the land. The only thing they would not do is worship the emperor. But everything else was good for the kingdom. And so Paul, in this moment, had to decide, okay, we're going to leave, and everybody who watched us get beat is going to think that Christianity is an illegal religion, that we teach things that we do not teach. He stood up for the message of God. The message that it is illegal was something that Paul did not want to leave them with, and that's what the magistrates did whenever they beat them, put them in jail. That was the last thing all those citizens had known, and that would have made Paul's ministry much less effective. I mean, they had heard that he had cast out the demon from the woman. They had heard about that. That takes some power. She had announced for days prior to this that this is the one who tells you the way of salvation of the Most High God. And so they had a good platform. And then if they would have left there, if they would have left in that moment, it would have tarnished the view of the Philippian city towards the gospel and towards the Apostle Paul. He could have left anytime he wanted to. And he did exercise his Roman right as a citizen, but it wasn't for the purpose of him demanding justice in his own case. Because we know that, because he didn't follow through. He could have insisted that those magistrates had charges brought up against him. He didn't do that. You could tell that justice was not Paul's goal here, even though that is kind of how this verse is usually counts. It was God's reputation that Paul cared about. He was worried about what was going to happen when he left, what was going to happen to the message. And so not only was Paul looking to protect the message and the mission of God, but he also wanted to protect the members of God. Continue reading. What are we on? We're going to back up. Yeah, so did I skip a verse? Let's go back to that verse. Okay, yeah, here's this. You remember this verse in Romans? Paul is talking about how the Jewish people were actually dishonoring the name of God because of their behavior. That your reputation and my reputation is inextricably linked to God's reputation. The moment you name Christ as your Savior, people watch you, and they watch me, especially a pastor. There's a funny story about a pastor who knew that whenever he was in a restaurant and as a pastor, I know this, men, you know this, all of this as well, is whenever you're in a woman that's halfway dressed, not very much, walks by, a half-clad woman who walks by, everybody looks at the woman, but most people look at the pastor. Who's he going to look at? Because how we respond also to conflict in our life. How do we respond to our wife? How do we respond to our husband? How do we respond to our kids? Everything that you and I do represents God in some way if you are a Christian. And so our reputation is inextricably tied to God's reputation. So the reason Paul wanted to keep his reputation good was not for his own sake. It was for God. It's for those who are watching God. And we can see that Paul was dismayed at how the Jews were supposed to be the people who represented God, and yet by their behavior it caused the Gentiles to blaspheme God. And you and I as Christians, we don't want to do that. Don't we want to represent God well? As I was studying this truth really came to bear on me in a special way, to where I had to stop and pray, ask for God for forgiveness. I had to confess sin to Him for that. Is that, do we walk in such a way recognizing that everything we say and do, whether people are noticing it or not, is a representation of God, if you're a Christian? How we handle our finances, how we handle our relationships, all of those things. Husbands to your wives. We represent God. As a pastor of the church, as an employee at your work, as a mother, everything you say to your kids or say to your husband, you in many ways are vicariously speaking on God's behalf. at a basic level, right? And so as I thought about this, we should all be looking to glorify God and to present the best possible picture of him to the world. And we're not doing it in order really to have our own reputation, or we shouldn't. It should be for God's reputation, that you and I want to live lives that are honorable and pleasing to him. And Paul was doing that. He was demanding that these rights be enforced. He wanted an escort out of the city. Escort out. See, that was a public demonstration. I got a public beating. The message you sent was not right. And so the only way to fix this is not for me to take you to court and put you in jail and do all that stuff. I don't have time. I have the gospel to worry about. But what you can do is escort me out. That would have been a public thing to see the magistrates. It's a formal escort out of the city. And that's the best possible case that Paul could leave the citizens of Philippi. And he wasn't just concerned about the citizens of Philippi, he was also concerned about the new believers as well, because you can see that he goes to Lydia. Imagine what would have happened if Paul and Silas would have left. What kind of experience would they have had in that city with those magistrates, knowing that these were believers and followers of Paul? If Paul would not have put these magistrates in check, as it were, and if that wouldn't have been the case, that would have left the believers, Lydia and all the rest of these people, in dire straits, or at least in a position that was less than desirable. And so you can see Paul cares about the mission, he cares about the message of God, and he also cares about the members of God. Move ahead of here. That is not Rick's fault, it's my fault. I went backwards, so. And so I'm reminded of this passage here. Now we who are strong, we are not giving anyone an occasion for offense, so that the ministry will not be blamed. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. I'm getting behind here. Let me do it this way. We're going to move ahead. Romans 15:1. So now, we who are strong have an obligation to bear the weaknesses of those without strength and not to please ourselves. Next verse, Philippians 2. Paul was writing back to these believers, and he was saying, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look not only to his own interests, but also to the interest of others. So Paul has this underlying purpose of defending God's reputation in the eyes of these people, in the eyes of the citizens, in the eyes of the leaders, and in the eyes of the believers while they were going there. I love what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 6. He goes, we are not giving anyone an occasion of offense so that the ministry will not be blamed. Instead, as God's ministers, we commend ourselves in everything by a great endurance. Paul's talking about the way he has to live his life in order to present God in a good light, or in the accurate light. Instead, as God's ministers, we commend ourselves in everything by great endurance, by afflictions, by hardships, by difficulties, by beatings, by imprisonments, by riots, by labors, by sleepless nights, by times of hunger, by purity, by knowledge, by patience, by kindness, by the Holy Spirit, by sincere love, by the word of truth, by the hand and the left, through glory and dishonor, through slander and good report, regarded as deceivers yet true, as unknown yet recognized, as dying you see we live, and as being disciplined yet not killed, as grieving yet always rejoicing, as poor yet enriching many, as having nothing yet possessing everything. I'll tell you, that is such a convicting verse of Paul's attitude. Don't you wish, there's a part of me that wishes, wouldn't it be great to transfer our attitude with Paul's? What would your life look like if you and I were to live that way, to where the mission of God is something that we protected in love and in grace, that the message of God was something that was very dear to us. I remember one time, whenever I was a manager in a store, it was me and another employee were Christians, and we were having just a regular conversation. But there was another guy and another girl, actually, that we had been witnessing to. And we were trying to nurture their faith towards Christ, and he and I were the only believers in this place. And so we were trying our best to sort of woo them to Christ. And we happened to be talking about a kind of a scandal that had been going on in the church. I don't remember what it was. I don't think it was some church had a big blow up and it was a big scandal. And he and I were talking about it. But one of these people walked up to us. And you know what we did? We shut our mouths. We did not want them. We wanted to protect the influence of God. We didn't want God to receive a bad reputation because of what this nutball church did. It's that kind of attitude towards the message and towards the mission of God, to where we want to protect the name of God. Yeah, there's a lot of crazy things that Christians do. There's a lot of things that we as Christians fail to do. But that should not reflect on God, but it does. And that God actually still allows us to be His people, in spite of the fact that we have the potential to misrepresent Him. And that's a marvelous thing, that He's willing to bring us to Himself. But it shows us the high responsibility that we have to follow Him. And so I want my heart to have the mission of God as something I want to protect. More than my dogs. I love my wife, I'm protecting my wife, but I want God's mission, and I want the message also. We want to be careful to protect the message of faith. And we also want to protect the members. We have new believers that need to be nurtured. And so our lives are going to reflect in a positive way or a negative way in another believer's life. And so wouldn't that be a great thing for us to exchange our life, our attitude for Paul? Last night, we were celebrating my birthday and my daughter-in-law's birthday at our house. We decided to celebrate it last night, and we were playing Uno. And I don't know if you guys recognize this or not, but they have a new card in Uno. Not when I was a kid, they didn't have this card where you could swap hands with another player. You guys heard that? Oh, that threw us off. We didn't really know how to play. And so my mother-in-law, who was there, she had that thing like 2 or 3 times, and she kept, swapping hands. It would be great because you pick the one with the least amount of cards and you swap hands with it, And it's like, I wish God would let us swap attitudes, I want the attitude of Paul, don't you? I want to have a zeal for God's reputation that causes me to be careful how I walk and how I live. And I know as a church we want to do that as well. We want our reputation in our community to be such that when people hear Trinity Fellowship, they go, oh, wow, that is that church. We want to be such a church that if we were to leave this neighborhood, people would notice. Don't we? In the next few moments, we're going to have a time of reflection and prayer. And probably like me, some of you may want to pray. And we're going to have people, men and women, on both sides of the auditorium, to where if you'd like to pray with someone, it could be about that, or it could be about anything. I think Denise is going to be on one side, and if we could get an elder or a man of any sort on this side, we want just men and women on each side. And what you do is ask God, look in your own heart like I had to this week, and go, wow, I don't have the attitude Paul has. I'm not as zealous for God's reputation as I should be. So what's it going to take for me to get to that point? What is it that's going to have to reinvigorate my heart and my life to have a healthy dose of respect for God's character and reputation that I can share it with others?